Hello, everyone. Okay, so buckle up because today we are talking about the myth of the perfect saddle. Ironic, coming from a saddle fitter, I know. But here's the thing, I like to keep it real. And the real truth is that there's almost no such thing as the perfect saddle, at least not the perfect saddle forever or forever saddle. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about the myth of perfect saddle fit while simultaneously challenging the saddle fits everything I put it on notion that's been so prevalent in the industry for so many years. Because at the end of the day, both of these things can be kind of harmful to the way that we're approaching our search for a saddle. So it's really time we look a little bit more closely at the industry's obsession with finding the perfect saddle and shift more towards observation, shift more towards adaptability, adjustability, and the partnership between horse and rider, as well as the partnership between the fitter and the horse and the rider, because that ends up making such a huge difference at the end of the day, having help that you can rely on. So my goal is to help riders release or let go of any guilt or frustration that they might be feeling around saddle fit or saddle struggles, as well as to educate you around what really matters and encourage you to trust your instincts and your horse. Because at the end of the day, every bit of behavior you see from them is their way of communicating something with you. And so often we don't know the signs of what to look for, and so we miss those subtle signs that they're communicating. Okay, so admit it. Raise your hand if you have ever chased the perfect saddle, the one that you thought would solve everything, make you a better rider, your horse would be amazing, it would fit perfectly, and it would just never need to be adjusted. I know for me, it was like my very first CWD. And I was like, this is going to be it for me and Dylan. Like, we're going to be stars. So now raise your hand if you found that saddle only for your horse to outgrow it or not really like it. Or maybe you just didn't suddenly become, a fast track to the Olympics like you hoped you would. So I completely understand that frustration, and not to mention the cost. I mean, I shared with you guys in a previous episode that Ellie went through 13 saddles in a year and a half. Oh my God. So I understand, you've probably spent thousands and thousands of dollars, only to wind up with a sore-backed horse, and maybe your fitter or your coach just telling you it's fine, and kind of brushing it off, even when your gut is telling you maybe something's wrong. So unfortunately, in the horse world, there's a lot of emphasis on the perfect saddle. And that idea is really perpetuated by marketing that companies do, as well as sponsorships. Sometimes there's some ego in the mix. Unfortunately, brands and trainers and even fitters often promise impossible perfection. Their websites claim their saddle will be the best thing for your horse. They're so comfortable, even if they never mention what tree shape that horse is designed to actually go on. So the truth is, it's actually impossible. Sorry to burst any bubbles. Spoiler alert. This is a bubble burster. It's impossible for one saddle to fit every horse you've ever put it on. So no saddle fits all horses equally well. And too often we see riders, sort of going under that assumption and often choosing a brand or the comfort of a luxury saddle, sometimes over their horse's well-being. And let's face it, that doesn't help anybody, because at the end of the day, even if you're comfortable, if your horse isn't, you're a team, and both members of the team have to be comfortable. So the other big piece of that is I would like to encourage riders sometimes to step outside of their comfort zone. You might sit in a French saddle and think, this feels so good. It's so comfy. It's so plush. But at the end of the day, if your horse doesn't go well in it, that's communicating to you that it's probably not the right saddle. And similarly, if your horse goes really well in something, but maybe it feels off for you, it's kind of helpful to keep in mind that we're capable of adapting our muscle memory and we're choosing to participate in the sport. Horses don't always get a say in whether or not we tack them up in a saddle that may or may not fit or feel good for them. And sometimes it pays to just step a little bit outside of our comfort zone, a little outside of the norm, and not be afraid to try out a saddle that maybe feels a little bit different. Now, not that we want the rider to ever be uncomfortable, just like we don't want the horse to be uncomfortable. Sometimes it just takes a little period of kind of warming up to a saddle and getting used to it, because your muscle memory and a lot of pieces of your equitation are likely tied to whatever saddle you've been riding in, for better or for worse. So if you're accustomed to a saddle that rotates your pelvis forward and you're a rider whose leg tends to go out behind you, that might be something that could be totally changed in a different saddle. And that would be a positive change. Now, say you're accustomed to having a really close contact feel, but your horse is really broad and you end up needing a saddle with a bit of a wider twist. That might take a little bit of adapting, and there might not be an obvious instant benefit to your riding. But if you see an instant benefit for your horse and it's something that your muscle memory can adapt to, that can still be a win in the long run. Really, some of the biggest challenges in the industry are that a lot of saddles are built on very similarly shaped trees. So if we look at our French saddles, for example, a lot of the manufacturers are getting their trees from the same place, or they're owned all by one conglomerate. And so a lot of those saddles are really fitting similar types of horses or made for similar types of horses. And so if you or your horse is a bit of an outlier from what the industry dictates is like typical, and whatever that is, I don't know, it can become a little more challenging to find your perfect fit. And so again, sometimes it's helpful to just start thinking a little bit outside of the box. Because the other big piece is that your horse's anatomy is constantly changing. And it's not just when they're babies, it's not when they're just young and growing, and it's not just when they're old. Things like training, nutrition, the seasons, whether or not they're shedding, they're all big factors. So, for example, like your horse in March is not going to be the same as your horse in September. Even shedding seasons burn a lot of extra calories. So it's very common that we see pretty significant changes in your horse's body condition during those times as they're putting energy into clearing out their old coat and growing their new coat. So the challenge with that is that we often then also see simultaneous changes in how their saddles fit. And the tricky thing is this can be a pretty quick snowball effect. Your horse loses a little bit of weight, your saddle starts to sink a bit, they get a little impeded, posture starts to get braced and holding. We have more tension. We lose the hind end engagement. We lose our bend. And what ends up happening is we end up losing harmony. So really, the goal should be progress and not perfection. And it should be like, I feel like we need to redefine success in saddle fit as like maintaining comfort over time, not chasing this elusive idea of perfection. Because the reality is, like, especially with non-adjustable saddles, so we're talking saddles that don't have an adjustable tree and have foam panels, like your chances are just a lot slimmer of being able to do anything if your horse changes. Now, don't get me wrong, that's not to say all adjustable saddles will always work either, because they absolutely will not. Unfortunately, it's just not the case. And again, I'm a straight shooter, so even the most adjustable saddle, your horse could still outgrow it. At the end of the day, your horse saddle's tree shape has to match your horse's back shape. And if that's changing significantly due to postural improvements or decline or massive changes or fluctuations in the horse's way of going or their weight, sometimes they just outgrow a saddle. And one of the biggest challenges as fitters that we face in the industry is that we all have different experience, different brand preferences, different biases, and we fit statically. So that's a handicap, because we can only fit a horse statically for something that has to work in motion. And as a result of that, it's hard to find fitters that agree on the major pieces of saddle fit, because oftentimes they don't even agree on the small pieces. Things like how much wither clearance, what's the proper tree width, half pad or no half pad. And the world tends to get divided. The equestrian world tends to get divided over things like that. So one thing that I would really like to encourage is that I want you to remember, you generally know your horse better than anyone. So if you feel like something's off, listen to your gut, because it probably is. So I encourage you to pay attention, listen to your instincts when it comes to saddle fit and what your horse might be trying to communicate. And I'm not saying instinct trumps science. I'm very much a science-based practitioner. And it's not a substitute for having a professional on your team. But ultimately, you know your horse. So it is our responsibility as riders, as horse owners, to take note of behavior, and notice, hey, they're a little off today, or this doesn't feel right. That doesn't seem like them. Because their behavior is their way of communicating with us. And they'll often let us know in little ways that it's time for saddle fitting. And regular tweaks and small adjustments can make such a big difference. So I often hear riders really kind of feeling upset with themselves when they haven't called me soon enough and we see that their horse is quite sore and they're beating themselves up like, oh, I should have known. I should have called you sooner. They were doing this and this and this. And I knew something was up and I don't know why it didn't cross my mind that it was saddle fit. So, next time, if you see something that's a little off in your horse, just make a note of it. And if you start to see those things adding up, just remember, you can always schedule a saddle fitting, because the sooner you catch things like that, the less deeply ingrained the pain and the other responses to it are going to become. So in a recent episode with equine osteopath Danielle Delage, we talked about the postural changes that can come from poor saddle fit and how it impacts everything in our horse, from their mental and emotional well-being to their gut health, their nervous system, as well as their musculoskeletal system. So we might only see sort of the external pain, but there's a lot of other things that can come from that. So really, if you're experiencing anything like your horse not wanting to go forward, not wanting to come to the mounting block, maybe they're struggling with their bend or their head carriage, missing their lead changes, maybe they're a little grouchy or they're kicking out the leg or they're a bit balky. All of those things are really worth noting because they're typically going to indicate that something is wrong. And, all of these things I've experienced 1,000 times over and are huge reasons why I developed my line of saddles, so the Lavasse saddles, because I was like, we really need to remove some of the barriers to proper saddle fit. We need things that are more affordable. We need saddles that are more adjustable, and we need to make adjustability a key factor in what we're approaching when it comes to saddles. Because at the end of the day, if our saddle is not adapting with our horse, it's working against them 9 times out of 10. So I've spent probably a decade hearing people say things like, oh, I just bought this expensive saddle and it doesn't fit, or, oh, my horse is changing shape constantly and I just don't know what to do because I can't be buying a new saddle every 6 months, or I feel so stressed, like I'm constantly shopping for a saddle or I'm constantly looking for something. And at the end of the day, even when we have the most adjustability in a saddle that's possible currently, it's still not always enough. So if you've ever felt this frustration, just know you are not alone. And a lot of it is just the way the industry sort of looks at things. And we're not necessarily taught to have a little bit more of a questioning glance at things. So regular checks, on average, every 6 months is recommended. But if you've got a really sensitive horse or one whose body fluctuates rapidly, you may find that they need something closer every 3 or 4 months even. And I find that is more common in horses that are stabled or stalled more often than they are turned out. Typically in horses that are turned out with a buddy, we tend to see their top lines maintaining a little bit more regularly than horses that are stabled for too long. So something to keep in mind. So when we talk about other things that influence saddle fit, things like muscle development. So as a horse builds muscle, particularly in the withers, behind the shoulders, or throughout their top line, the contours of their back actually change. So for example, increased development through our longissimus dorsi muscle, which is the main muscle that holds our saddle source saddle support muscle, that can cause an increase in how much your horse is actually lifting through their back. So that engagement that we're typically asking for when a horse is more comfortable, they're going to use their back more effectively. The challenge becomes that can really drastically impact the way your saddle is fitting, and especially if they haven't been carrying themselves in that way previously. You may wind up with your saddle wanting to sit and tip you forward or tip you a little bit backward, or just become a little unstable as that horse is now engaging. The other tricky thing is that can make them more prone to pressure points. So as we're seeing an improvement in top line and way of going, sometimes we see a decrease in how well the saddle is fitting. And those two things are kind of frustrating when they happen in tandem, but it's very common. And then on the other side, fat distribution is another thing that plays a huge role in saddle fit. So often horses get little fat pads in different areas, and they're not always symmetrical. So that can really impact the way your saddle sits, and can often lead to things like saddle slip, where your saddle wants to go off to one side, saddle sink, where your saddle kind of sinks a little bit more but isn't moving, or just other lateral imbalances. And this is often a temporary thing, but does still need monitoring, because we don't want the horse uncomfortable, and we don't want to be preferentially loading one area of their body. The other thing that really impacts saddle fit is postural changes. So we've talked a little bit about this already, but postural changes, again, when they're positive, fabulous, but it can impact the horse's spinal alignment, even kind of the way their conformation looks when we're seeing positive changes in their posture. When a horse learns how to correctly self-carry, for example, the way that they're moving through the hindquarters, the back, and the withers are all going to change the point of contact in the saddle and the center of gravity. So again, it's really tough in saddle fitting, because often if we're doing the right things and improving the fit and improving the horse's comfort and their way of going, we're going to see a trickle down effect of their body changing and then the saddle needing to be adjusted. So it can be a bit of an up and down roller coaster, unfortunately. But even Sue Dyson, who does a ton of research on equine lameness, she's shown that postural changes and how that impacts movement has a dramatic effect on saddle stability, rider balance, and can really create either continued positive improvements in horses' postural change, or can create negative postural adaptations in their avoidance of saddle pressure. So if you feel like your horse is suddenly changing their behavior, maybe going a little bit differently, a little heavier in the bridle, I really encourage you to become mindful of their body condition, their overall level of softness, willingness, level of stress they have under saddle can also be a really good indicator of whether or not they're comfortable, and be proactive about addressing the fit. Because if your horse starts to feel worse than they have before, or if you feel like you're suddenly struggling with your position, like you're now tipped forward when you haven't been, or suddenly you're in a chair seat when normally you don't struggle with that, it's a good time to get your saddle checked. Now, this is something that's obviously near and dear to my heart, being a saddle fitter. So I wanted to do something special for my listeners, because I do believe it's important that you guys have something tangible that you can take with you and maybe check to gauge how well your saddle is fitting. So I have developed a complete saddle fitting guide that I am going to include for you guys as a downloadable format. And it is full of diagrams and helpful tips showing you kind of the do's and don'ts of saddle fit. And this guide is really designed to help you gain a better understanding of how your saddle should fit, help you train your eye as well to spot fit issues before they become a bigger problem. It covers things like balance, fit around the shoulder, pressure points, signs of discomfort, and so much more. So I will include the link for you guys down below. And I really encourage you to get curious about saddle fit. Find a fitter that you trust. Find someone who has your horse's best interest at heart. Find someone who you can ask questions to, who isn't shy about answering them and really digging into what might be going on for you and your horse. Because at the end of the day, their medical history, their soundness, their attitude or mentality about going riding, or their attitude around their work, are all really key indicators of how they're feeling about it. So, and usually how they're feeling in their body. So I would love to hear any saddle fitting stories that you guys want to share as well. The good, the bad, the ugly. It's nice to share things like this so that the rest of us can feel less alone. Because again, if you're struggling, chances are somebody else is too. And if you're looking for a saddle and fit that grows with your horse, check out the Lavos line or lavosequestrian.com. And really, I have aimed to deliver unbeatable prices with unparalleled style and so many customization options for both horse and rider. So really, I'm passionate about helping people build their dream saddles. And the universal gullet system in our saddles does help you weather the ups and downs of your horse's changing body condition. So although no saddle is always guaranteed to fit forever, having a lot of adjustability really does help improve the lifespan of a saddle. So if you're sick of worrying whether your saddle is working for your horse, or you just are sick of having something that can't be made to fit them when the time comes, maybe it's time you start asking more of your saddle. So check us out. And thank you so much for watching today's episode. And I will see you guys next week. Until then, stay unbridled, stay curious, and thanks for watching. Take care, everyone.